Okay. Well, good evening. Thank you all for joining us. This is the Kansas Forest Service Book Club. Really excited to have you guys on with us. We are recording for anybody that isn't able to join, but you should try to join because we always end up having a good discussion. And tonight, I don't think it'll show up with my virtual background, but we're talking about The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben. It may be the corner of the book. I got the illustrated version of the book, not realizing that it was abridged, which is a sin in book club reading to get the abridged version. So you guys will have to fill me in on what I missed. But the pictures were beautiful. So I'm really excited to talk about the book tonight and just trees in general to have that discussion. So, what did you guys think of the book just to kind of start out the discussion? Had you read it before and you kind of refreshed yourself, or was this new for anybody?
It was new for me. I downloaded the Audible version and listened to it. So
Nice.
I'd read several other books on trees, but this was a very interesting take.
That's great.
Hello.
And
See, doing all right. See, had to update my Zoom app.
that always happens.
I had to confess, I didn't get through the whole book, but it was reminiscent quite a bit of Overstory. I really enjoyed reading Overstory, and so which is why I kind of got interested in this discussion. But uh, it seemed to be pretty repetitive, and I got a little I don't know a little I don't know what the word is, frustrated or exasperated with kind of the anthropomorphic uh, view of trees. Although I love trees, but it seemed to be really kind of out there on as to that.
Did take it to an interesting level. I've got a couple questions about that for you guys.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Overstory. I read that as well. Overstory, I think, took it even further than this book. And I was wondering if she borrowed from this research in writing that book.
Which, well, I think both books kind of take on the woman. I don't know much about her, but I think her name is Suzanne. Now I can't remember her full
Can't
name,
remember.
but the researcher that first uh, did a lot of published these ideas about and findings about the interconnectivity of trees in the forest and things like that. I think they both kind of feed off the same research, which I don't know if anybody else has really duplicated or not.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, I think that book might be that you're talking about. That might be Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. Is that right? Because I think the
Yes, yes.
Overstory is the Richard Powers book, which is also about trees, but a little bit different. They're
Yeah.
all great.
But yeah, that's the research I'm thinking of, and the researcher that came up with some support for that notion, which I think is fascinating, and I'm not trying to say I think it's right or wrong, but I think it's been subject to a lot of criticism in the scientific community, as I understand.
So it has not been replicated, her
That's my
find?
understanding.
Yeah. Okay.
What do you guys feel like was maybe something that really surprised you as you were reading through this book? Maybe it was sort of some of those applications to trees thinking and feeling and talking, or were there other aspects that were
I,
interesting?
I'll throw one aspect out. That he spent a chapter or half a chapter talking about the death of a tree and how is it defined and how is it measured. And I found that to be fascinating, um, because I've witnessed some of what he was describing, with old stumps and still trying to grow, still trying to survive. I found that chapter very interesting about the notions of death.
Yeah, I agree because it almost seems like there isn't a moment. It's sort of a slow, yeah.
Does a quick question? Does everyone in here know each other?
No, do we want to do some introductions?
I was assuming maybe I was joining a book club that I'm the only new member, but maybe not.
No, I know a couple faces, but not everybody. I can start and lead us around. So my name's Ariel. I work for the Kansas Forest Service. I'm the communications coordinator, but I also have my bachelor's degrees in horticulture, so a love of plants. And I started this book club just as a way to kind of familiarize some people with our staff and what we do a little bit, but also just because I really like books and nature. So it's definitely selfishly motivated. But we have a couple other KFS staff on, but some new faces as well. Brad, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure, I'm Brad Pippin. I own a bit of land out in the central part, eastern edge of the state, and I'm a consumer of the K-State forestry uh, process, if you will. I've probably bought and planted around 1,000 trees out here on my place. Um, Not all of them have been successful, but I'm getting better at it. I have a better batting average now. But I'm not a trained horticulturist or anything. I just love trees. I love nature. I love being a steward of this land. So I thought I'd join you guys tonight.
Glad to have you. I'll just leave it open, whoever wants to hop in. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm EJ Jameson. I'm also with the Kansas Forest Service. I am the Northeast District Forester, so I cover the 10 counties out in the northeast corner of Kansas. So my office is in Oskaloosa, and yeah, I try to tune into these book clubs whenever I can. And sorry, I've been hopping in and out. We are actually getting new floors at our house today, and they're just finishing up. So I want to help them out as they pack up.
Oh,
So
that's so exciting. You'll have to send
it's
me a picture.
we are in dire need of this, so good to have it done. But thanks for joining.
EJ, do you have
Yeah.
Lynn County? Do you have Lynn County?
I do not. That's a different forester, actually.
All right.
Sorry about that.
The,
Sorry, go ahead, Chester.
okay. Yeah, I'm Chester Hubbard. I also work for the Kansas Forest Service. I'm the GIS analyst. So if you see any maps that come out our organization, I'm usually the guy that's making it or updating it. So, but yeah, I'm a member of the Prairie Van Potawatomi Nation. So this book was pretty cool to read through because it oh kind of has some similarities to some of our views and all that. But yeah, love nature, love maps. Yeah, that's who I am.
So I guess I'll go next. My name is Mark Clark. I think I participated in I don't know that it was a book study, but it was the last Wild Places in Kansas. Was that a book study
Yep,
with
that
this
was our
group?
last book club. Mhm.
Okay, yep. I really enjoyed that. And anyway, so I thought I'd dive in here. Just full disclosure, I just couldn't connect with this book at all. I only made it about 10% the way in and kind of gave up. But I wanted to get everybody else's take, and since most everybody else read it, they can tell me what it's all about. But anyways, I'm cheating a little bit. I'm a
That's in
landscape.
every book club.
Okay, all right, right. I'm a landscape photographer on the side, hoping to be more full time at it when I retire. And so I threw up one of my pictures as my profile. And I love the outdoors and can't get enough of it. So anyway, glad to be here. Very glad to be here.
Thanks, Mark. And Nadine put something in the chat. She says she doesn't have a microphone, but she's a retired landscape designer with a hort degree. Just love trees and the idea that they can communicate with each other. So thanks, Nadine, for joining.
I'm Gary Flory. I'm retired. I have no background in horticulture, interested in trees. I live in McPherson, actually right in the middle of town, but have about 3 acres, and we have about 65 or 70 different tree varieties on our property, including about 20 different oak varieties. I first read this book 5 or 6 years ago, and I've frankly only skimmed it in the last month or so, so I'm not all that fresh on what's in it. It always stretches me a little bit to read this, and I don't know whether it's because I just find it fascinating or find a little bit that I'm not quite sure how much I buy into. But it's interesting. There are a lot of things that I don't buy into that I think are my issue, not the issue with the trees. So
Thanks, Gary.
My name is David Link. I live in Wichita. Grew up in Kansas. I'm a retired lawyer. Been retired for 5, 6 years now. Enjoy camping in a lot of the different state parks in the state, and continue to be fascinated by trees and how they evolved. And as I say, I read Overstory, really enjoyed that book, and that whole concept of trees being, what's the word, supportive of each other and communicating in ways that we don't understand, which certainly seems plausible to me, that the idea that they have intent and or that they're sentient somehow, I think is a little bit of a stretch, but I'm fascinated by the ideas.
Awesome. Thanks for joining, David. Well, I'm with you guys on kind of the overall feeling of the book. It's, I think about the connection of trees. There are definitely some symbiotic relationships and things like that, things we've been able to prove through science. But a couple, even in the abridged version, a couple things I was reading where it felt a little out there. What do you guys feel like was the most, like the claim that he made that you really just didn't feel, either you didn't believe it or maybe there wasn't that scientific research to back it up? Because not everything he said was cited. Some of it really was just kind of how he felt.
I'll jump in there. He talked a lot about mothering and how a tree will mother the trees around it. He also talked about not just the symbiosis, but trees being aware that another tree is in dire straits, and then help and rush pushing nutrients to help that tree. Um, I agree with our lawyer here. I don't I don't think it's a sentient thing. I think it's a product of evolution, and it very well may be serendipity that the the roots share the same ground, that they share some of the same nutrients, and that they can take advantage of each other. But I don't think he presented that in some cases as if it was a decision the trees were making to push
Right.
push resources down to one of their trees friends. He calls them friends that need help, and it's a stretch. I find the actual evolutionary aspect of it more entertaining than and more inspiring than trying to think of it as a sentient being.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good point.
I agree with Brad's take on that. Again, I've only read about 10%, but one of the concerns I had was that the translation wasn't being necessarily truthful to the original author. Not that there was a lie or anything like that there. It just, maybe it was more of a story that was being told in a in a more passionate way, but it really came across to me as very sanitary or sanitized, or yeah, just not enjoyable. Not the joy might have been taken out because of the translation from German. It must be difficult to do, but that was one of my concerns with this, that maybe we're missing something because we're not reading it in the original author's exact words. So
Translation's a good point.
That's a great point.
Yeah, one of the things that that Brad's comment made me think about was, when we're talking about these individual trees sending nutrients to other trees as they're starting to die or dying, it's always interesting to consider like the individual tree success versus the population success from an evolutionary standpoint too, because yeah, those trees, even if that individual tree is not going to, benefit from giving its nutrients away, that is going to promote the overall population. So from an evolutionary standpoint, the population as a whole would benefit from that. So whenever I come to think about, like the sentience or the benefit of an individual versus population, it's kind of cool to back up and see how those individual actions can ultimately lead to, a more productive space for that whole forest. So it's the individual tree versus population that kind of gets a little bit complicated in those conversations.
Definitely.
If I could jump off of where you left off, EJ, something I found very interesting in the book that I may be doing wrong. As I've planted oaks on this property, I'm planting them around old farm fields, and I do my research with the K-State program, and they tell you how far apart you should plant them and everything else. And so I have rows of trees that I'm working to keep them alive. Then in this book, I read that lone trees suffer significantly from the lack of neighbors. And so as I was reading that, I was thinking, okay, what is a lone tree? Is it 20 feet apart? Is it 60 feet apart? Is it a half mile apart? And it has me rethinking about, I'll continue planting trees until I can't, but it has me rethinking how I'm going to perhaps do it moving forward and maybe change how I'm laying out the new plantings. I'd welcome anyone's thoughts on that if they have any knowledge on that or opinions.
I don't have any knowledge, Brad, but I'm curious, how old are your trees? How long have you been planting them?
I started in 2012.
Okay.
And I've usually tried to plant at least 100 trees a year. And
are you planting them as saplings or
the bare root trees from the Kansas Forestry Service? And unfortunately, my most aggressive year was 2012, and I started 385 trees about a week before the worst recorded drought in history.
Yeah.
And I lost. Some survived. I actually had, and I wasn't watering them then. I had some that actually survived that. But now, between the big killer out here is deer, and
deer?
so if I don't put deer tubes, I have about a 90% mortality rate in my trees.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm required to put in deer tubes.
And when you say deer tubes, that's just like
it's a white plastic tube that creates a greenhouse effect. Trees, it has pros and cons. The pros is it protects it from deer, and the trees will shoot up very rapidly to reach the light at the top. The con is when they do that, they're really, really skinny.
Mm-hmm.
So this recent ice storm, I had 12 trees that came down that I had to, they aren't dead, but ice brought them down because they're just not strong enough because of those deer.
How tall are those tubes then?
5 feet.
Yeah. Interesting.
And
needs to come in.
Yeah, we always recommend leaving those tubes on until the tree like entirely fills that tube, because you're exactly right. They're just not quite strong enough to support themselves. Yeah. And sometimes people take them off too early and the tree will just kind of like lay down in our Kansas wind.
Yeah. And what I've done, he asked, it's been 12 years. The originals that I planted are out of the tubes now, but then I surround them with snow fence, because without that, the deer will kill them. They'll rub their antlers on it and kill them.
Yeah.
So they're not eating them. They're just kind of knocking them down, or what?
Originally, they'll eat them. They just eat them right out of the ground if they have access to the seedlings. But now they'll rub their antlers on them and kill them. I mean, I have some that are a 5-inch base. They'll kill one of those in one fall if they're not protected.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's also kind of a good example you were talking about lone trees. Yeah, if you just plant a handful of trees in a field, those deer are going to find those trees. So that's just one example of how that works. But yeah, a forest is going to create conditions that can favor those species. So, trees growing in a forest in some ways might have a better go of it than a tree growing on its own. But also a tree growing on its own is going to have essentially limited or unlimited resources. It's not going to be competing for sunlight. It's probably not going to be competing for water, depending on where it's growing, of course. So those are some benefits there. But I mean, here in Kansas, savannas were a really important part of our landscape and still are today. And that is really just scattered trees growing in prairie, grasses and forbs. And especially since coming to Kansas, I've really come to love grasses and forbs and recognizing how important prairie is too. So yeah, I think a lone tree growing in, essentially a prairie ecosystem with an intact mycorrhizal community and diverse flowers and grasses, that tree is going to have a much better advantage than just like a tree growing in, a cool season grass pasture or growing amidst asphalt. So, the spectrum of lone trees is kind of hard to define.
Is there just like a chart with like trees and asphalt at the bottom? Like that's the worst.
That's it.
Yeah.
I would say for me, one of the claims that I struggled with, and I wasn't really making a claim. I kind of agree with Mark that maybe some things lost in the translation from German because it kind of seemed like he was telling a story, but it's mixed in a way that I think is kind of confusing. But saying that a group of women is happier in walking through a happy forest than not. And there's so much research about people outside in plants in sunshine with nature are happier, healthier, less stressed. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to say we can maybe intuitively tell. I mean, I guess outside of a visibly dead tree makes me somewhat sad unless I recognize that it also has a part in the ecosystem. That one was a little out there for me, I think.
Yeah, I can't tell if a person is grumpy or not until I start talking to them. And I don't talk to trees, so it's a little difficult for me to buy into that as well. So
Yeah. And how are they measuring that happiness of that group?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like one of the ways we see that here in Northeast Kansas is with bush honeysuckle, because bush honeysuckle is just when you have a really significant bush honeysuckle infestation, that is just a very unhealthy forest. There's essentially no ecosystem functioning happening there under that bush honeysuckle. And actually, I mean, there are some cool examples in Johnson County from people going into those forests and not necessarily knowing all the plants around them, but they could recognize like, hey, this is a really dense shrub and it's causing problems in that I can't see other plants. And then also just from like a safety concern, if I'm walking on this trail and I can't see 5 feet in front of me. So it was kind of cool to see all the different complaints people had about that one plant for so many different reasons. So as an interesting example of how forest health issues was actually super visible to the public.
That's super cool. And I would say if he had said in the book, take a forester and put them in a healthy forest, then yes, their happiness is going to be.
I'm a little picky, I guess, but that's okay.
I could see that with bush honeysuckle though, because it's such a monolith. It makes it hard to navigate. That's super interesting, EJ.
I thought another interesting point he made a couple times in the book or several times in the book, and it was a theme in Overstory. And it was the theme of the unhealthy nature of monocultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what that might mean, like with what I'm trying to do out here, I recognize now that I need to be careful about not just planting the same trees and getting a mix, but it's a travesty the way a lot of the big companies are creating monocultures across thousands and thousands of square miles of land, not recognizing what that's doing to the forest. But I thought that was an interesting take.
Well, and speaking of monoculture, I wondered, because I didn't get that far into the book like some of the rest of us. But does did he postulate that the communication between trees is interspecies, between different species of trees that they, or is it just is his theory that it's just that only the same species of trees communicate with each other and pass?
Yeah, he talked about it several times. And I'll let someone more knowledgeable than I answer your question. But the portion that I read was he was highlighting the lack of diversity and how that could damage the different symbiotic relationships that occur across species. He wasn't the chapter I'm thinking of. He wasn't really talking about, hey, the aspens are talking to the birches. It was more about in those there are benefits that they get from one another that if it's a monoculture, you're not getting those benefits. And then there's other literature out there about the impact of that on insects. Gary, if you haven't read The Nature of Oaks, your lot there, your 5 acres sounds like the backdrop of that story.
I have read that. It's a very good book.
It's a wonderful book. All right, I'll stop yapping and listen.
No, that's what we're here for. I don't remember, David, if he said, or at least in my version, anything about different species communicating, but I mean, and EJ's more knowledgeable about this than I am, but there is research that shows that within species communication, or some of these words we attribute to people is hard to say, but like treating herbicide on species that are near each other, that those root systems can be interconnected, there could be damage, things like that. So we certainly know that within a species, they're connecting and are transferring something, whether that's, pheromones or chemicals or whatever that may be.
Yeah, we were kind of getting at this earlier too, but it is really interesting looking at the different words we use for trees and humans. And I know that a lot of people in the scientific community did have an issue with the anthropomorphizing of the trees in this book. And we were chatting about this already a bit, but it is really interesting. And I feel like I've honestly, I feel like in school and grad school, I was very much like, okay, yes, let's just try to keep it more objective. Let's not use these, human-like words to describe animals and plants that are very much not human, like they have their own mechanisms and we should do our best to understand those. But honestly, I think after being a forester for a while, I've come more into the lines of feeling more okay using those words just because it is so much more approachable, and somebody who doesn't spend a lot of time reading research articles or even in the woods, it's just a lot more relatable. And I don't always think it's a bad thing for people to relate to trees and plants and see themselves in there. So I don't know. I'm very torn on those topics, and it's really interesting to think about and discuss.
That was actually my next question, EJ. When in my previous job, when I was a horticulture agent, I taught a basic botany class, and there was this video I would show, and you can find it on YouTube. I don't remember what it's called, but if you search, I think it's like acacia trees communicating, you can find it. But it's this study that was done in Africa. They had a game preserve, and it was kudzu. I think that's what they're kudu. It's a big, it looks, yes, thank you. Not the invasive plant. I'm just mixing up things. Kudu were dying on this game reserve, and they long YouTube video cut short found that when any animals were heavily grazing acacia trees, the acacia trees would put out a chemical that could kill the animals, but also send out a signal to neighboring trees. What they were trying to do is map how many miles that signal went, like how big that is. But if the animals fed at a more reasonable rate, particularly in years where there weren't drought, they didn't have that chemical signal. But using words like they talked to each other, they warned each other, they cared about their community. Like EJ said, I think we struggle with that, but I do wonder how much of it's cultural, tied to our language. Are there other cultures that are more open to kind of that concept? I'd be interested to see how you guys feel about some of those things.
I read a book recently called The Monarch and the Milkweed, and it describes some of the defense mechanisms of the milkweed. And when a caterpillar starts eating on the milkweed, one of the things the milkweed does is it sends out scents or pheromones that attract other insects that eat caterpillars.
Mm.
And so, one way of saying that is, it releases a pheromone that attracts killer insects. Another way of saying it is it calls for help from its friend, the caterpillar eater, and brings him in to save the day. And they're saying the same thing. It's just, are you being more technical and more technically correct, or more romantic about it? And I think that's what a lot of us get hung up on with the sentient and emotional aspects of trees.
See, like, I will say, just like from like a kind of like my own like perspective of everything, because like the Potawatomis, they've always kind of believed that everything has a soul, and so they kind of always related to like kind of the gosh dang it, anthropomorphic, kind of like just kind of giving everything human characteristics. And so just kind of like being raised and all that, and as along with oh kind of becoming part of the scientific communities, it has been kind of interesting, kind of just having a clash of ideals and just kind of trying to pick out the best way for that, I guess what I'm trying to say for that. But it's gosh dang, apologize, I lost my train of thought.
No, I'm with you, Chester. You were you were making good points.
Mhm. But yeah, so I guess just from like my own like people's culture, is just like, oh, I'm kind of used to just kind of like referring to like everything as though it's kind of almost human or just a person or it has its own soul. And because even in our language, we kind of like talk about it in that way.
A great point.
Yeah, I think that's really really important to consider too, and reminds me of Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book Breeding Sweetgrass, and the
Uh,
whole focus of that book is blending traditional ecological knowledge with science, and how they can work together. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that.
I was
yeah, that,
just thinking of that book, EJ. I was thinking about I need to start thanking these trees when I'm cutting firewood. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up, EJ. Before we end our discussion, which we're not doing yet, you guys can't let me forget to ask you what we should read next. But I just got Dr. Kimmer's new book on serviceberry, and I think it could be a good book club contender. It's not very long, and I'm already like partway through it, and it's really good.
Yeah,
She's awesome.
I read that in one sitting over the
I
holidays. It was
bet you
great.
did. I bet you did. No, Braiding Sweetgrass is really good. And then I have her other book, Gathering Moss, but I haven't read it, but I've heard it's good.
It's very good. Yeah, it's much more about gathering moss than breeding sweetgrass is about breeding sweetgrass, but I still love it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where we are in the topic.
Oh,
in
you
the
just
talk
jump in
exactly.
wherever you want.
Okay, good. That's exactly what I'm going to do. But I did make it through and was anxious to read more about the defense mechanisms. And I didn't necessarily need any hard science words to describe what was happening. But I was also left wanting more. The book is so full of ideas that a lot of them, or at least this one, seemed to be quite abbreviated, and I was left wanting more of that. I'm aware enough to know that the plant world is full of examples of defense mechanisms, as well as mechanisms to attract the positives, the colors of flowers, etc. And I was really left wanting more of that. So that might be some part of my interested in science more than the poetry of the book, but the potential poetry of the book. But for a new reader, that could be quite eye-opening, just that one little paragraph or little chapter. They don't know that that's a thing, and it's quite clearly a thing, quite scientifically proven over and over. So I'm glad it was in there. I don't mean to be just critical of the book. It's not worthy of that, but I was left wanting a little bit more. So
It's a good point, Mark, about, who is an audience for this? Is it really supposed to kind of spark your interest? And if you said something about, well, the trees have evolved to have this mycorrhizae around the rear, like maybe you kind of scare somebody away, as opposed to like Brad's example with the milkweed, saying
yeah,
like it called its friends in, is maybe just a way more approachable way to get somebody to open up to that concept if they haven't heard it before.
yeah. Again, it wasn't so much as the approach that he chose. It was I could have heard more examples of it.
Yeah.
I guess it's more not the detail, but the breadth of the subject. So, but
Yeah.
I was glad it was included, because absolutely it very much could spark somebody's interest, and then want them going out and hopefully uh, finding out more on their own, because there is so much more to know. So.
I have a question for the trained foresters here. He was pretty brutal on you guys. There was, and probably justifiably so, I believe. And it's not on you, on foresters actually, but on academics. And there were several times when he said, "I learned this and it was wrong." And I've seen that in several books that I've read, and I'd welcome your thoughts on that. I celebrate it because what it means is we're learning, and we're learning how to be better. Um, have we come a long way? Do we still have a long way to go? Just throw that at you.
Yeah, that is a great question. So yeah, our forestry practices have definitely evolved. And some of the foundational silvicultural practices and silviculture, and honestly, it's been a while since I've read this book, and I did refresh, so you all might know this and have explained this, but silviculture is kind of defined as the art and science of controlling the growth and establishment of trees. So it's really a combination of science and art there. But some of those foundational silvicultural principles have really evolved over the last few decades. And there is an approach called ecological silviculture, which is really, really focused on, first and foremost, maintaining and promoting ecosystem function. And so there definitely is a way to sustainably manage our forests for many, many objectives, one of those being timber. And it's a really tough conversation because, I'm a forester, I love trees. And so I think it's important to recognize that, we have to be managing our forest well, and that, if we're killing a tree here and we are utilizing that tree, and that is a locally produced sustainable resource, as opposed to using plastic, which is not renewable, not sustainable, or importing wood from all across the world, which is, way more fossil fuel intensive. So I think that local wood is going to be a really important component of climate change adaptability and resilience, and then finding novel ways to use that wood as well. Like cross-laminated timber is a super cool industry, looking at how we can replace steel with wood. So yeah, that's kind of a lot there, but I think that forestry gets a bad rap because of some really unsustainable practices that have happened, but there are ways to manage our forests to promote ecosystem function and get that renewable resource that we really do rely on. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but those are my overall thoughts.
Thank you. No, it wasn't long at all. Um,
And
no,
then also too, I guess just to add, here in Kansas, especially, our forests are disturbance adapted. They are fire adapted communities. Our whole landscape is, and indigenous people have been managing intentionally with fire for thousands of years. So the lack of management and the fire suppression policies are very much, kind of a new addition. And when we remove that fire, when we remove that management, we actually lose some of the ecosystem function that we have here in our central hardwoods in Kansas. So I think it's important to recognize that not all management is bad, of course not, and we can implement management that can actually restore some of those important functions.
I'll just put a really selfish plug in here because I love hearing EJ talk about this kind of stuff all the time. EJ, and along with some other of our staff and a guest, will be our podcast guest for February, talking about a really cool burn that they did at Baldwin Woods. But also our March podcast. I'm clairvoyant. I don't record ahead of time. I just know what we're going to have in March. Is Brian Armbruster, who's another one of our foresters, talking about the history of trees in Kansas. And one thing EJ said that really reminded me of the discussion with Ryan is talking about a lot of forestry practices that we consider good practices today were forestry practices that we have evidence. We don't have a lot, but some evidence that indigenous cultures in Kansas were doing before Kansas was ever a thing. But that colonization and settling of Kansas, we just destroyed a lot of stuff and lost a lot of knowledge. And so I like what you're saying, Brad, about like we're learning and we need to do better, but also some of it is like, let's go back and do things a way that has been somewhat forgotten by certain parts of our culture. But those are both upcoming podcast episodes that I think will be really good.
I think we can't lose sight of the fact that nature's pretty good at it too.
Yeah, we tend to be the issue.
Yeah. Not always, but
we try to help when we can.
Yep.
This has been a really great discussion. Before we kind of wrap up and talk about maybe what a next book would be, are there any final thoughts? I think we all liked the book. I didn't love the book. I'm not feeling like anybody really. I loved the pictures. I highly recommend getting the abridged version. It was really nice.
Yeah,
I want to borrow that.
You will. What were you saying, David?
I'm interested in looking for the abridged edition because maybe it'll rekindle my interest.
It's pretty nice. Well, nobody has to answer on the spot. I might do another survey to the list. I'm not sure, but I'm always interested in you guys made the effort. You showed up to book club. So I am really interested if there's anything that you're looking at reading. I was actually looking over at my shelf and finding The Mother Tree, which you guys had mentioned. I've got that. I haven't read it yet. But there are a lot of great options. Does anything appeal to this group?
What are the left and right limits on topic?
I mean, I think we definitely want to keep it natural resources. Doesn't have to be trees, but also, I mean, we could go kind of out there. I think that makes for a good discussion. This wasn't exactly like a science-based text.
I think it's good to have some science basis in what we read, but I would hope it's not too technical. I've only been to one other book club with the Forestry Service, and that was on mushrooms. And frankly, that was way too technical, and I got virtually nothing out of that.
Sherry's a lot smarter than the rest of us on mushrooms.
I think for me, it needs to be something that is not for people who are professional horticulturists or
Okay.
May I ask something?
Yes, you may.
I'm sorry, I'm just late getting into this, but my name's Jane. I'm in Hutchinson, and
Hi, Jane.
I'm just curious. We farm, living on the farm that my great grandfather homesteaded in 1873, and he planted a lot of bur oaks here. There are still 3 that have been. He probably planted them before 1900. And they still produce acorns. I wondered what the lifespan of those is. Can you give me any idea of that?
That's a great question. I'm going to field that to EJ, who has a definite answer.
Okay.
Got an exact answer for you. No. So yeah, I mean, bur oaks are definitely one of our longer lived trees here in Kansas. So that's a very old tree looking at there. And I think that, tree death is never caused by one thing. It's going to be many things that contribute. But bur oak trees, depending on the site, can, I would say, live, well over 200 years.
Wow.
It really depends on the individual tree and where it's planted, but they're gonna keep going, and the spectrum between life and death for trees is very broad, as I like to say.
Very good. Well, thank you. I'm a tree hugger of the real kind, but with those three, I have embraced them and just wondered what they've lived through all these years, and it's just a treasure to me to have those. My family always planted a lot of tree rows, and our farming is dry land, but my dad was a bird lover, and so tree rows, other people would be yanking them out and putting in irrigation, and we've always felt like we benefited from the trees in many ways. One, in having a lot of birds there to eat the bugs and so forth, and then as far as an upcoming idea for a book or some discussion, I'd like to think about something with with weeds. I just was reading a article about weeds. What we call weeds are things we don't know what to do with, basically. And the amount of pigweed that grows here, or amaranth, I'm wondering, instead of wheat, maybe we should be growing that, because it is so prolific and strong and adapted to this place. So some ideas on that for what we think is of value to produce food for people, for us, actually, and others. Thank you for this. It's so interesting. I wish I'd gotten in on the very beginning, but thanks. I'll be encouraged to join on whatever else you put up later on. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. And that same email where you got this Zoom link, I will send out the recording. So if you missed the beginning, you can watch the recording.
Wonderful.
So,
thank you.
Yeah. Great suggestion, too. I wrote that down.
Ariel, I don't know what books you guys have reviewed in the past, but in line with what Jane was talking about, the book Nature's Best Hope.
I love that book.
It's fantastic.
Thank you.
And
yes, we did The Nature of Oaks, which is another Doug Tallamy book, but we haven't done Nature's Best Hope, but that's very good.
I thought the oak book was good. I thought the Nature's Best Hope was excellent.
Mm-hmm.
It addresses exactly what Jane was talking about.
Good. And I have read The Nature of Oaks. It didn't grab me, but I will definitely read this Nature's Best Hope. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
It's a little wider. It's not, The Nature of Oaks is obviously very centered. This, I think it's a lot more approachable. That's a great idea. That's a great suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you guys think of anything, obviously you have the KSU email, which I answered because that's what the Zoom link came through, but I'll also put my email in the chat. So if you think of anything or have any questions, or you just want to talk about trees, that's what I like to do all day. So feel free to send me an email. If you need to connect with any of your foresters, if you have a question about maps, Chester's our person. We're so excited to have him on. Or really any of our services. Our community foresters work with municipalities. We have a great wildland fire program that both trains firefighters and are those first responders for wildland fires. And then, of course, our conservation tree program, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, buying baby trees. And what EJ does as a rural forester is all really vital work. So if you ever need any of those connections or have questions, I'm happy to be the middleman there. But I really appreciate you guys joining me. This was a wonderful discussion. Very interesting.
Thanks for doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Happy to do it.
Thanks,
I'll try to read the whole
for
thing
your
next time.
expertise.
Yeah. Well, it's always the goal that we'll all try to read the book, but we'll see how it turns out. All right. We'll see you all next time. Have a good evening.
Thank
Thanks very
you.
much.
Meet you all. Bye-bye.